what I'm advocating, the founding fathers of the United Nations, who were brilliant, wise men, mostly from the West, if they were alive today, they would support my recommendation. And now India comprehensively, by the size of its GNP, by the reach of its diplomatic influence, by the scale of its reach, is now a much more significant power than the United Kingdom. I would not be surprised if various British professors or media people criticize my proposal. This is perfectly natural. I mean, I can
Yeah.
understand why the British want to cling on to some of the privileges of the past, but there are also other very, very thoughtful British who acknowledge that time has come for change.
Hello and welcome. You're watching the Hindustan Times, and I'm Abhishek Singh. Today, I'm joined by Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Professor Mahbubani is currently a distinguished fellow at the National University of Singapore. Former president of United Nations Security Council, Professor Mahbubani is a seasoned and prolific author. So far, Professor Mahbubani has penned down 9 books, and his 10th book, Living the Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir, has just hit the shelves. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
My pleasure, Abhishek.
Professor, I know they say don't judge a book by its cover, something most of those who enjoy reading and take it seriously tend to agree with. But let me be a bit blasphemous for the Puritans and say, if not because of the cover, I will pick it up just for the title. Because when a seasoned diplomat such as yourself chooses to call his memoir undiplomatic, for students of diplomacy, it becomes a must read. So 10 on 10 for a clickbaity title, and of course, what I'm sure is an unputdownable read. Would you like to throw some light on the title to begin with?
Well, I mean, when I was born in 1948 in Singapore, it was a British colony, and India, of course, had become independent a year earlier. And Singapore was a typical poor third world developing country. I grew up in a single bedroom house. I was put on a special feeding program when I went to school because I was technically undernourished. I didn't have a flush toilet in my house. My father went to jail. Gangsters were fighting in the streets in front of my house. So I had a typical poor third world childhood. And in my lifetime, I've seen Singapore transform itself from being one of the poorest countries in the world to now having a per capita income that is bigger, that is higher than that of United States or the United Kingdom. So I've traveled this incredible journey from third world poverty to first world comfort. And the good news is that what I have experienced in my life is what hundreds of millions of Asians are now experiencing. And that's why this is the Asian century, because it is the Asians who are going to drive the course of history in the 21st century.
Right. And of course, the other part of it, the latter part of it, an undiplomatic memoir.
Well, I mean, I do tell stories that are somewhat out of school, as they say, in these memoirs, and I reveal things that perhaps should not be revealed. But I do want people to get a real feel of how diplomacy operates. And I can tell you, when I first attended my first ASEAN, as you know, is the Association of
Yeah.
Southeast Asian in Southeast Asia. When I attended my first ASEAN meetings in 1971, there was so much distrust between Indonesia and Malaysia because there confrontasi between Singapore and Malaysia because we had just separated, between Thailand and Malaysia because of separatist issues, and so on and so forth. So what's amazing is that despite the massive suspicion we had among the Southeast Asian countries in 1971, today ASEAN is the second most successful regional organization in the world. So we've gone through tremendous transformation. And I try to describe in my book how that happened. And one of the secrets, by the way, your listeners will be amused to hear, is that the secret is to play golf with each other. So if you
Right.
can imagine Indian and Pakistani diplomats playing golf with each other, you'll see some very interesting things.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I'm looking forward to read it. But and we will come back to the book. But let's go back to your article, which you wrote in the FT for a while and discuss what you propose, because your proposal for the UK to give up its UNSC permanent membership and India to replace it has raised a bit of a storm in diplomatic circles. But what would you say? At least the latter part of it, I'm sure, is being echoed by developing nations and, of course, India. But for our viewers, could you please tell us about the rationale? Why do you say what you've said?
Well, what I'm advocating, the founding fathers of the United Nations, who were brilliant, wise men, mostly from the West, if they were alive today, they would support my recommendation. Because the founding fathers of the UN believe that the only way to ensure that the UN survive for a long time and not die like the League of Nations, as you know, the League of Nations died because the United States refused to join it. But why has the United Nations survived so long? It has survived so long because the founding fathers of the UN said you must give a special seat for the great powers of the day. And that's why they were given the veto power. The five founding permanent members: United States, United Kingdom, France, Soviet Union, China. Now, the reason why they created the veto is to ensure that the great powers of today were in the UN, not the great powers of yesterday. But 80 years have more passed since the UN was created. It's 79 technically, and clearly the great power have changed, have shifted, have changed, and now India comprehensively, by the size of its GNP, by the reach of its diplomatic influence, by the scale of its reach, is now a much more significant power than the United Kingdom. And frankly, I'm not anti-British, by the way. I mean, I'm not in any way trying to harm the British. I actually believe the British will be better off passing on the burdens of a great power from themselves so they can take care of their domestic problems and say, India, maybe it's time for you now to see whether you can run the world in a better way. And that's exactly what the founding fathers of the UN would have said if they were alive today.
Also, and on a slightly technical note, it may or may not be correct, but did you suggest that India should replace UK because a mechanism to include additional members does not exist?
Well, I think certainly the UN Security Council should be expanded. I mean, in fact, I've written a whole book called The
Yes.
Great Convergence with a formula for Security Council expansion. It's what I call the 777 formula: seven permanent seats, seven semi-permanent seats, and seven elected seats. So
Right.
certainly we should do that. But the UN has been discussing UN Security Council reform for over 32 years, since 1992. Nothing has happened. So clearly, if you're waiting for the comprehensive reform to take place, it will take much longer. So why not start with small steps? And the first small step is for UK to give up its seat and give it to India. Given the special relationship between UK and India, this will be a very generous gesture on the part of UK. And then that will trigger a larger process of change, and then you can bring in other powers like Brazil, like an African permanent member, which I think also needs to be done. But we can start step by step with first India replacing the UK.
Now, both Prime Minister Modi and India's Minister of External Affairs, S. Jaishankar, have been trying to make India's case in very strong words. But nothing has happened on that front for some reason. What's obvious for the rest of the world continues to fall on deaf ears at the UN. Reforms are being discussed for more than 3 decades, but to no avail. Could you tell us why?
Oh, there's a very simple reason for it.
Yeah.
For every country that wants to become a permanent member, it has a neighbor that says, why not me? So when Brazil wants to join, Argentina says, why not me? So Argentina then blocks Brazil's entry. For Japan that wants to join, there's a South Korea neighbor that says, why not me? And as you know, in the case of India, when India wants to join as permanent member, Pakistan says, why not me? And of course, the most humorous intervention I ever heard in my life was from the Italian ambassador to the UN when I was ambassador there. And he said at a public meeting, he says, why is everybody pushing so hard for Germany and Japan to become permanent members of the UN Security Council? He said, we, Italy, we lost World War II also. So we qualified to become permanent members too. I mean, you can
Right.
imagine everybody laughed when he said that. But you can see, therefore, that that's the reason why things don't change. Somebody else was always saying, why not me? And that's why in my formula of 777, I've created the class of semi permanent members. So those countries that seem to be losing out get a rotating membership every 8 years. So there are ways and means of doing it. But again, all this will be triggered if you can start with the process of India replacing UK's seat in the UN Security Council.
Right. But when it comes to words and articulating why a particular country should be a member of the UNSC, of course, everybody has done it. Everybody is trying to do it. I mean, you were giving the examples of Brazil and Argentina. But what it also takes, perhaps, is actions. And the heft demonstrated by India at the global stage of late, whether it is Prime Minister Modi most recently visiting Kyiv, just after a visit to Moscow, which in of itself amounts to a big statement. Those actions also need to be there. And India has been trying to demonstrate that for the last few years at least.
Hmm. Yes, certainly. And in fact, as you know, in my Financial Times article, I do mention there are very few world leaders today that can go to Moscow and be received warmly by President Putin, and they can then go on to Kiev and be welcomed warmly by President Zelensky. That shows the new stature that India has on the world stage. And frankly, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom can't do that. And what I feel sad about is that, I serve on the Security Council, and you could observe how things work because the relative power between the United Kingdom and US has now become so big. The United Kingdom often doesn't have an independent foreign policy in the UN Security Council. They almost always automatically support the American position, and they are in no position to take an independent view on many of the issues. So, therefore, the British will be relieving themselves of a burden if they give up their Security Council seat to India, because I think then the British can play a more useful role on the world stage as an independent middle power that can give independent views of all the great powers, and British sagacity can be an asset to the world then.
Right. And when it comes to the leadership of the global south, India, of course, made the case once again when it was hosting the G20 Leadership Summit. Do you think at this point in time, if there is a country which can represent the interest of global south vis-a-vis, especially in front of the Western powers, do you think India is in that position to do that? And what kind of justice it has done in the recent past for the role that it is aspiring for?
Well, I would say the countries that can represent the global south effectively are the members of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Because as you know, the global South is a very large and diverse place,
Of
and
course.
they make up 88% of the world's population. And the fact that many new countries want to apply to join BRICS shows that BRICS is a sunrise organization, unlike the G7, which is a sunset organization. But at the same time, India has clearly played a very important role in the global south. I thought that the India's success in getting the African Union to become a permanent member of the G20 was a huge achievement, and India should be commended for giving the African Union a seat at the table. And by the way, what India has done by giving the African Union a seat in the G20 can serve as a precedent for Security Council reform also, because we all agree that Africa should also have a veto in the Security Council. The Africans cannot agree among themselves who should be the African representative. Should it be South Africa? Should it be Nigeria? Well, we can make the African Union then a permanent member of the UN Security Council, just as it is a permanent member of the G20. So, what India has done creates a helpful precedent for other multilateral organizations also.
Professor, the United Nations was founded in 1945 after World War II, and its history can be traced back to the Atlantic Charter of 1941 and the Declaration of London that came before it. But the reason UK was included as one of the big powers at that point in time was because UK had colonies all around the world. Now, that in itself is a problematic reason given we're living in the 21st century. Now, do you think just for that reason, UK should give up its UNSC's permanent seat and let India replace it?
Well, as you know, it's actually quite remarkable, Abhishek. I still don't understand how it happened that a
Yep.
hundred years ago, in the year 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could rule effortlessly over 300 million Indians. Can you
Right.
imagine? Not 100,000, maybe 500,000 Englishmen trying to rule over 1.4 billion Indians. It's inconceivable. We cannot even conceive of it. But the inconceivable happened. But that in itself showed what a great power the UK was in 1924, in 1934, and frankly, after it won World War II in 1944 and in 1945 when the UN was founded. But the United Kingdom of today is a small shadow of the great power that it was. And therefore, the best thing that the United Kingdom can do is to gracefully accept the fact that it is no longer going to be among the top five economies in the world. Actually, it may not even be among the top 10 economies of the world by 2050 or so. So it's better for the United Kingdom to accept where it stands in the world today, make the adjustments, and frankly, if the UK were to present its seat to India, that would be one way also of closing the chapter on the colonial record. Because when the final history of the colonization of India is written, there'll be some very unpleasant chapters about what the British did while they were in India. And as you know, Shashi Tharoor documented this quite brilliantly in the Oxford Union debate that he participated in. So,
Yeah.
the best way to ensure lasting friendship between two of the most important democracies in the world, UK and India, is for UK to accept the new reality. And there's no question about this, that India is a far more significant power, global power, than the UK, and to cede its seat to India. There's common sense.
And perhaps that would be the most perfect reparation. I mean, Mr. Tharoor, of course, asked for a rupee as a symbolic gesture, but I suppose this would be the perfect reparation.
Oh, this will be the perfect way to closing a chapter on a very difficult phase of the history between UK and India. I mean, one has to acknowledge, of course, there's some positive things that the British did also, and certainly in my case, the reason why I'm able to talk to you now is because the British taught me to speak English when I was a child in Singapore, and as you know, in India is probably the largest English-speaking country in the world today. So there are some positive legacies also that the British have left, and for which we should thank them also.
Now, Professor, for our audience's benefit, let's see how a diplomat deals with critiques. Because after your piece in the FT, Professor Max Hilaire wrote a letter in which he said your suggestion is a non-starter. And among the reasons he cited is that India is not the right country to represent developing countries on the Security Council, as in recent years, India has shifted its geopolitical priorities and no longer identifies with the concerns of developing countries. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, I would not be surprised if various British professors or media people criticize my proposal. This is perfectly natural. I mean, I can
Yeah.
understand why the British want to cling on to some of the privileges of the past, but there are also other very, very thoughtful British who acknowledge that time has come for change. I mean, as you know, I begin my column by
Yes.
quoting the probably the
Martin
most
Wolf.
influential economics commentator in the world, Martin Wolf, who said, I think, I don't know, 15 years ago, he said it by 2020, UK is still a permanent member and India isn't. Then that's, as he said, if I'm not mistaken, the word he used was laughable. So,
Yeah.
when times change, we have to adjust. We have to adapt. These are realities of the world. And it is wiser to adapt in advance rather than being forced to adapt and change. Because if the Security Council doesn't change its composition, as I said earlier, it will lose its credibility. And if it loses credibility, then it'll no longer be a useful organization to the world.
Right. And of course, now let's go back to your book because the title of the book is very interesting, and I'm sure you must have heard this phrase yourself as well, and that is that this is Asia century. You've been hearing it for a while, but for our viewers, if you'd like to sort of in few points summarize why do you think this is Asia century, and of course give us a bit of an overview of the book.
Well, I think for a start, let me say, before I published this book, Living the Asian Century, I published an open access, a free book called The Asian 21st Century. And the
Right.
publisher was a German publisher, Springer Nature. And I met the publisher. I asked the publisher, how many downloads should we aim for of this free book, Asian 21st Century? And the publisher, Springer Nature, said to me, if you get 20,000 downloads, it'll be a very good result. But instead of
Right.
20,000 downloads, we've had 3.6 million downloads. The target was
Wow.
20,000. The result is 3.6 million downloads in 160 countries. What does this
Right.
signal? It signals that the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century. Now, it's therefore we can help the leading minds in the West to accept the reality that this is going to be the Asian century. And the goal of my both that book, Asian 21st Century, a free book with any of your listeners can download, or my latest book, Living the Asian Century, is to describe how Asia has succeeded. What were the secrets of Asia's success? And in the case of Singapore, by the way, the founding fathers of Singapore, the three founding fathers of Singapore, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, uh, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and Mr. Rajaratnam were absolutely brilliant, amazingly brilliant. And they were incredibly shrewd and capable too. And they charted Singapore through very difficult waters of separation. I mean, as you know, India and Pakistan were separated and still
Yes.
continue to have a very painful relationship. Malaysia and Singapore also separated, but we now have a very happy relationship. How do we achieve that? And this is a result of some brilliant founding fathers. So, what I try to provide in the book from time to time is a few nuggets of geopolitical wisdom on how you manage relations, especially with difficult neighbors and difficult countries.
Right. And before I let you go, Professor, one last question. And the question is, what do you see as the biggest hurdle in front of India?
Well, I think it's very important for India to have pragmatic relations with all the great powers of the world. So, in relations among great powers are not based on friendship, they're based on interests. And India can enhance its interests by emerging as a truly independent third pole in the world. So, as we know, the two greatest powers today are the United States and China. These are the two poles of great power. India can be the independent third pole of great power. And many of the countries in the global south want India to be an independent third pole that they could work with as they try to counterbalance the pressures that they are getting from the biggest contest in human history, which is the contest between the United States and China. So, therefore, there is a massive diplomatic opportunity for India today on the world stage to become the third independent pole in a new multipolar world.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. And of course, we wish that more and more people, of course, pick up the book. I am definitely included in that list, and we will probably have a longer conversation after I have gone through it. But thank you so much for taking out the time today and talking to us.
Thank you. My pleasure.